when I was a young child. I don't remember what age I was, but we were living in New Jersey, so I must have been around 5 or 6 years old. And my dad woke me up in the middle of the night, and he said, "Come with me." And I was really groggy. I remember my dad got me in the car. He said, "I have a surprise for you." And he drove me a while, and we drove to this field. And we got out of the car, and I kept saying, "Dad, what time is it?" And he kept saying, "It's the middle of the night." He didn't say what they said. It's the middle of the night. And there were all these people in this field, several dozen. And my dad brought a picnic blanket, and he put the blanket out on this grassy knoll, and we laid on the blanket, and we looked up at the sky. There was this fantastic meteor shower, like the Perseus meteor shower that we have sometimes. And I just remember looking up at the sky, and every 15 to 20 seconds, there was a fantastic of light across the sky. And I think that was my first introduction to the world beyond the earth. That probably first impregnated me with wanting to tell stories not of this world.
With his interest in the cosmos sparked by the meteor shower event, Steven Spielberg obtained a telescope and began taking an interest in astronomy. His father was a science fiction fan who read a lot of books and magazines, and young Steven would often borrow his father's periodicals to study. By the age of 16 years old in 1962, Steven never missed an episode of Twilight Zone, and he was well versed in such films as The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Forbidden Planet, and any other film he could see, since he himself was already making his own movies with fellow friends and cast members in Phoenix, Arizona. Because he was into science fiction, he was also interested in flying saucers. And one night, his Boy Scout group was camping in the desert, and they saw a brilliant red light rise up from the desert and proceeded to fly off into the sky. Steven was really upset he missed the event, and in his frustration, he began writing a 67-page screenplay called Firelight. The story was about a group of scientists who investigate disappearances in a small town after 3 balls of light descended on the locale. They discover a group of bad aliens are responsible and kidnap the people to put them in a zoo. Up to this time, Steven had made many home movies and even won awards for short films as a teen. However, Firelight was something different. Steven wanted to make a feature. At 17 years old, in June 1963, Steven and his father amassed $600 and put it towards his new production with the support of friends, classmates, and family. The movie began filming under Steven's first amateur movie company called American Artists Productions. After 6 months of making the film, he cut it down to 135 minutes long, and through a family friend, the film premiered at the Phoenix Little Theater in March 1964, and Spielberg launched into a publicity campaign to promote it. Steven tasted his first success when the screening sold out thanks to the publicity campaign, and the movie made $800, thus making a profit for Steven. When Steven was interviewed by a newspaper for the premiere, he stated, "I hope to interest Universal in producing a big screen remake of the 8mm epic." Little did anyone know at the time that he was germinating Close Encounters of the Third Kind. His victory was short-lived when his family suddenly moved to California. He would be an unknown senior in Saratoga High, where he felt alone and ostracized. Within a short time, his parents would talk divorce, and Steven felt pressure because his father didn't like the grades he was getting and wanted Steven to move away from his filmmaking hobby to assert himself in the real-world job market that involved a college degree. When the inevitable divorce came, Steven ended up going to live with his father in Los Angeles after graduating high school. This move would put him close to his dream of working in Hollywood. He applied to the University of Southern California, but was denied due to his poor grades. With the draft looming for Vietnam, and to appease his father, he ended up attending the California State University at Long Beach. The odds of Steven landing a Hollywood studio job were almost non-existent. During the 60s, studios were overstaffed and mostly filled with middle-aged dinosaurs of the industry. Young people were not hired for their talents in filmmaking. They were hired for their physical labor and acting. Yet to Steven's luck or fate, whatever you want to believe, Hollywood was changing. In most cases, the younger audience didn't want westerns and musicals anymore, nor did they want big-budget epics that lasted over 3 hours. The studios needed to change. Enter Easy Rider in 1969, about two bikers on a round trip involving drugs and free love, with a dark fate looming. The film was a monumental success fueled by young audiences, and Hollywood suddenly realized that their outlook towards their audience needed to change. Hollywood started looking for new perspectives that attracted audiences rather than repulsed them, and take faith that this will occur as well in modern times. But in the late 60s and early 70s, they began hiring directors like Robert Altman, William Friedkin, Dennis Hopper, and Francis Ford Coppola, to name a few. But Spielberg wasn't like those new talented people. He had no academic ties to Hollywood or a degree, but he did have one friend named Chuck Silvers, who was an editorial supervisor who worked at Universal Studios. When Steven was in high school, he gave him a tour of the studio thanks to family ties, and Steven showed him his Firelight film. Steven was passionate about film, and Chuck knew he had talent. It was through Chuck that Steven got an unpaid internship as a clerical assistant in the editorial department, and it allowed Steven to explore Universal Studios from the inside, and he learned everything he could. He was so enthusiastic, he would sleep in the offices often, and would make contacts left and right within the halls of the studio. From there, he worked his way to making a musical film for the band October Country called Amblin that got him recognition for his filming style and his technical skill. Studio executive Sidney Sheinberg offered Steven $275 a week to direct television projects. Steven dropped out of college and went for it. By 1971, Steven Spielberg gained strong attention with the release of his film Duel, and from that came his first Hollywood film deal, Sugarland Express. While filming Sugarland Express, Steven worked with two writers named Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, who wrote the film. Steven was well versed in UFOs, as he never abandoned his interest in the field, and discovered that Hal and Matthew had their own idea for a UFO story in mind about a police officer from the South who investigates a disturbance at a farmhouse and has a close encounter with a UFO. After reporting it, he is ridiculed, and even his own family doesn't believe him. Obsessed, the man joins a UFO group, and when the aliens return, he leaves the planet with them. Steven had a lot of ideas about a UFO movie in the early 70s, which included a couple seeing a UFO, or he thought he might make a documentary about UFOs. After reading Dr. J. Allen Hynek's book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Spielberg began drafting ideas that mirrored Hynek's. It was to be a thriller about a Project Blue Book agent whose job it was to debunk claims of UFO encounters. The agent would soon encounter a real UFO and aliens and realized that the government's true aim is to cover up the truth. The agent would do his best to expose the conspiracy before the aliens would land, and the film would end with humans and extraterrestrials having formal contact. The treatment was called Watch the Skies and was registered with the Writing Guild of America. Spielberg was set to direct the movie, but another project caught his attention, and it was a movie called Jaws. After the director dropped out for Jaws, Steven was considered as director for the film. While the script of Jaws was being rewritten by Howard Sackler, Steven was nervous about the fate of this film. He thought it might not happen. So, on his free time, he tweaked the idea of Watch the Skies. While playing poker with Alan Ladd Jr., Steven pitched his political thriller Watch the Skies. aliens. Ladd liked the idea, and he wanted to do business with Steven, but he only had television movies under his belt, and Sugarland Express had not been released yet. Steven needed more credibility to make such a film. Steven was friends with a couple that were currently producing a film called The Sting, and they were Julia and Michael Phillips. He would attend their social gatherings at their house on the beach, and at such events, Steven would meet lifelong friends like Brian De Palma and Martin Scorsese. Since he was currently shopping for producers, it made sense to him to approach Julia and Michael, especially since they were his friends. And Michael happened to love science fiction like Steven. The producers backed him, and the trio had an official meeting with Alan Ladd Jr., who was already keen to the idea, but now that producers were backing the deal, it looked more sellable. Ladd approved the idea to develop a screenplay. Spielberg turned to his team on Sugarland Express, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins. The writing team thought Steven was a good sell and pitched their idea about the cop encountering a UFO at a farmhouse and being maligned by everyone until he leaves the planet with the aliens at the end. Steven liked their idea but wanted to go with his Project Blue Book route. The writing team passed because they wanted their vision and were close to directing it, but Universal Studios dropped their take and the budget came out over $7 million. Steven's producer couple was currently working with a writer named Paul Schrader, who was working on another project for them called Taxi Driver. After talking about it, Paul suggested the Blue Book agent should be a skeptic that doesn't believe in UFOs until he sees one, and it turns his life upside down. And by the end of the film, he would search for the truth until he would enter the ship willingly and leave the Earth with the aliens. When they proposed Paul as their writer, Ladd didn't like the idea of paying $35,000 for Schrader to write the film, as it was too expensive already, and when Julia and Michael insisted, Ladd backed away from the project. After these events, the script for Jaws was now done by Sackler, and with Watch the Skies on hold, Spielberg put more focus on Jaws. While Steven worked on post-production for Jaws, his producing couple would propose Watch the Skies to the financially strapped Columbia Pictures, whose new studio head was Julia's old boss, David Begelman. A meeting occurred, and Begelman showed immediate interest because he knew Julia well, and The Sting was a hit waiting to arrive at theaters. He also loved Steven's Duel as well, and he liked the idea of Schrader being the writer. It was a great package, but there was one thing that was bothering Begelman. How much was this going to cost? No one discussed the budget because they were shopping around for interest. However, Steven immediately said $2.8 million. Nobody believed that was possible because the film was ambitious and such a low budget couldn't realize that. Still, no one argued it during the meeting. Begelman, impressed, approved the film, and a deal was made to finance the script. If it went well, they would make the movie. Steven would later be questioned by Julia and Michael why he said $2.8 million. It was the highest number that Begelman would listen to without objecting. With that, Steven went to make Jaws while Julia and Michael focused on Taxi Driver. Paul Schrader's first draft was called Kingdom Come, and this was his version. Major Paul Van Owen is a Project Blue Book agent who travels the country dismissing or debunking UFO sightings. One night, while driving, he encounters a real UFO and he reports it and is ridiculed within his own agency and friends. As his marriage falls apart, he threatens the head of Project Blue Book to expose the cover-up, and in an effort to silence him, the head of Blue Book suggests he join Project Grief, which is an organization that goes to extreme lengths to keep the public from finding out about the crafts. While not doing that, they spend the majority of their time trying to contact the aliens in an attempt to foster a dialogue. With no marriage and no love for dismissing other claims, he says yes. For 15 years, Van Owen spends his time in Project Grief, but manifestations from the memories that aliens implanted in mankind's collective consciousness millions of years ago. Yes, the scriptwriter who wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull came up with this schlock, and he was paid $35,000 for it. Anyways, Van Owen takes a spiritual journey into his abstract subconscious and finds the alien memory, and he realizes that it's a message to rendezvous with the alien at Idaho's Black Mountain. He travels there and meets up with the Happy Greys, who then offer him a ride on their mothership, and he leaves the Earth behind with his new buds. Stephen hated this script, and so did Michael and Julia. Writer Paul Schrader said it best, since writers are usually their worst critics. It had little to do with the UFO phenomenon, and nothing to do with the movie I wanted to make. It was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Worried that they might lose the deal with Columbia, Julia did not show the script to David Begelman. Of course, Schrader left the project, leaving the film in jeopardy. The two producers began looking for another writing option. The good news was The Sting was a huge success with Academy Awards, and Sugarland Express also arrived in theaters. Stephen's name was growing, and off he went to work on Jaws. While Stephen was filming Jaws on July 19, 1974, John Hill was approached by Julia to write the newly retitled Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He had done some television and would soon be known for the weird Heart Beeps and the wonderful Quigley Down Under with Tom Selleck. However, he was relatively new in 1975, and he was best of all cheap. After getting the job, Hill went to his job at an ad agency and quit. I kept expecting the two producers or the studio to have me get started writing right away, but they kept deferring to the fact that Steven Spielberg had the idea more in his head than anyone's. So let's wait and meet with him. So Hill studied J. Allen Hynek, the UFO phenomenon, and after a month went by in August 1974, producers Michael and Julia flew to Martha's Vineyard with John Hill to meet with Stephen, who was slogging away on Jaws. They went to his cabin for a weekend get-together and waited and waited and waited, while Stephen was out to sea trying to get his shark working. To pass time waiting for Stephen to show up, Hill would play Pong with Richard Dreyfuss a lot. The meeting happened on a Saturday, and the film was discussed along with Steven Spielberg's changes. The story continued to be about the debunker for Blue Book that kind of bullied people into not reporting, and then he sees a UFO for real. He wants to report it on record, and when he does, he is shut out of the program. He realizes he was part of a cover-up, and he begins having nightmares that always involve a mountain image in his mind. Obsessed, he tries recreating the image in everything he sees, and it scares away his family. He is really cracking up until he sees the image of the mountain on the TV after a proposed nerve gas train derailment. Our main character then rushes out to prove the Air Force is lying. He sneaks to the area and finds the secret base where contact with real aliens occur. After the first meeting, Stephen returned to film some more scenes, and Michael went with him. At the time, the concepts didn't fully gel with Hill, and he approached Julia with some concerns. I had been a science fiction fan all of my life, and I explained to Julia, probably patronizingly, how mixing ESP and UFO was not a good idea at all. I said the first rule of good science fiction is that you ask the reader or audience to accept one fantastical plot premise, but everything else, including human behavior, then has to be real. I said you just can't mix witchcraft and Bigfoot, or the Loch Ness Monster and time travel, or UFOs and ESP. Then, further digging myself into this hole, I cringe at remembering, I said I had just spent almost 5 years in advertising, and you don't want to go out with a blind title. No one knows what it means until after they buy the product. And a clumsy title like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, quite obviously, I explained to Julia Phillips, who humored me in a nice way, that title was not memorable, didn't communicate anything to the average moviegoer. On Sunday, it was officially an off day for the Jaws crew, and it was traditional for Stephen and the Jaws crew to play a local team at softball, and Hill was frustrated that Stephen didn't clear that day to work with him. Stephen, after all, was working 16-hour days, 6 days a week on Jaws, and therefore took his one day off very seriously. Hill was sent back to LA, and he started working that week. Hill would continue to communicate with the producers about his progress, and during one meeting with Julia, he got to witness more than he wanted to. Julia was a brash person. She said what she meant, often with language that John Landis called satanic. She was also blunt and very quick to anger, and when she got angry, she let people know it around her. She was also very lewd, not only in her humor, but her actions, and on this occasion, when Hill arrived, Julia wanted him to have a script meeting with her while she was sunbathing topless. Hill insisted, much to Julia's annoyance, that she get dressed before they work. These kinds of shenanigans and lack of self-restraint would no doubt contribute to a looming divorce and cause more problems, as you will soon see. In November 1974, John Hill turned in a script for Meeting of the Minds, not Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but there was a bigger problem besides the title. Richard Nixon resigned 3 months ago, and Vietnam ended, and Steven and the producers thought audiences like themselves would be turned off by a movie about more government cover-ups and lies. So they decided to start from scratch story-wise. Soon after, John Hill got the phone call from Michael Phillips. John, you did the assignment and took us down the road we said, but that has let us see clearly now. That is not the direction we want to go. So thank you for helping us in that way. You're a really good writer. You know I'm a fan, but we're taking you off the project now, so we can go in a new direction with a fresh writer. And that was that. I got paid by the studio for later drafts no one ever wanted, and I was off the project. And life moved on, and years later, when the beautiful mothership rose into the night sky and cinematic history, I was left behind, a footnote. In early 1975, Spielberg was nervous. He was deep into post-production for Jaws and feared for his future. Rumors were swirling around Hollywood about Jaws issues, and Steven thought if he didn't get another gig quick, if Jaws flopped, he might not ever get another directing job again. So he felt compelled to get a directing job before Jaws came out. With Close Encounters in limbo, he entertained ideas. He was considered for Mario Puzo's Superman, but Alexander Salkind wasn't convinced that Steven was right for it and insisted that they wait to see Jaws first. Then, he was about to do producer Rob Cohen's The Bingo Long-Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings, which was a Depression-era comedy drama about a baseball team tired of being treated like slaves. Steven was hired by Cohen to direct it, but no contract was made. Steven even hired Joe Alves to research the subject matter and begin researching the time period, as Steven's hands were full with Jaws. Whenever they worked together, Steven told him about Close Encounters, and Alves finally stated, "Boy, that sounds a lot more interesting than this baseball thing. Maybe you should do that." After talking with Alves more, Spielberg recanted leaving Close Encounters. He left the baseball film, which would later be directed by John Badham, and starred Billy D. Williams, James Earl Jones, and Richard Pryor. Spielberg decided he had to step up to the plate. This was the movie he wanted to remake since he was a teenager, and he wanted it to be more personal and filled with wonder. He knew he had to write the script himself. A deal was made with Columbia to write the film, but the studio warned Steven to keep budget in mind, as the studio had little to spare and banks were wary of the studio's big-budget ventures. In his first draft, the organization chasing the UFOs was experts operating under the UN and were positive in nature rather than oppressive. The main character of this script was named Norman Greenhouse. He is married to a wife that doesn't understand him and kids who don't listen to him. Norman is a power company trouble foreman who ventures out during a blackout and encounters a UFO. During the second act, Norman is obsessed with an image of a mountain in his mind, and his family just isn't up for it. When Norman builds a massive model of the mountain in his living room, his family leaves him. Breaking down, he sees the true representation on the television and heads there despite the warning of danger, and sneaks to the dark side of the mountain to to discover where first contact will occur. In the skies above, UFOs would make it appear constellations were changing by moving around and stopping, and Norman would stare up into the skies with tears in his eyes. To communicate, the aliens would use music, and Spielberg spoke to John Williams about it, who had just worked on Jaws. Spielberg knew the composer would be utilized for this film and went to him early on to make sure he could secure him. The aliens would be gentle and peaceful, wanting communication. I was always a strong advocate of that. If they are smart enough to get here, they're advanced. They're not coming here to conquer us. Stephen even reached out to Hal Barwood while writing and told him about his idea and mentioned that he wanted the protagonist to leave Earth as his family rejected him, and he has nothing left to anchor him to Earth. Since Barwood and Robbins never wrote an official script, their plans to make a UFO film fell apart. Barwood stated that he was glad that Stephen's movie got made and that these ideas got expressed as well as they did. Once Stephen decided to make the protagonist go with the aliens at the end, there was the question of who would witness the tale, and that person became a new character called Jillian Guyler, who would take pictures and be a fellow believer called to the mountain. The first person Stephen hired officially or rehired was Joe Alves. The two worked on mountain prospects in Stephen's office at Universal. On June 20th, 1975, the day Jaws opened, Joe left the studio to search for the inevitable site the final act of the film would take place at, and that was Devil's Mountain. When Jaws premiered, it was a monster, and if you don't know about that film's struggle, we covered it in previous videos. So if you like what we're doing with this one, check that out too. Spielberg was immediately the hottest director in town. Alexander Salkind came out of the woodworks and offered him Superman, and Universal came to him about Jaws 2, which we will soon cover on this channel. But Spielberg now knew he had the power to make Close Encounters the movie he dreamed of. In August 1975, Stephen finished his script. As the script begins, a town in Indiana loses its power, and Norman Greenhouse is sent out to investigate. He discovers lines have actually been stolen by someone. While driving, his car shuts off and he encounters a UFO. Over his radio, he hears that police are chasing strange lights. He finds the area the police describe and sees the alien craft to witness them fly off into the skies above. It is after this scene that the air traffic control detects several unidentified objects on their screens, and two planes discuss what they see but will not report a UFO. The pilots state some of their passengers have taken pictures. They are ordered to land immediately. Agents meet the plane on the tarmac and they confiscate camera or tape recorders, stating that the government was testing classified material in the area and for security's sake they must remove any photos of said experiments. They also state they will return the cameras afterwards. We then cut to Norman sitting in a field crying in wonder as morning approaches. In the clouds above, you can see UFO lights. Jets fly in and the lights suddenly disappear. All but one. The jets try to chase the remaining UFO and it does amazing feats of movement before disappearing. It is then that Norman returns home. Norman's home life is not great. His wife Ronnie is consumed by her suburban existence and can't even comprehend anything beyond normalcy. And when he heads to an Air Force base to report what he saw, he is treated like a nut job. Determined to show proof, he returns to where he saw the UFOs, but comes away empty-handed. Soon, Norman breaks down, consumed by what he experienced, and he is plagued by the vision of Devil's Tower. He sees it everywhere and builds a copy of his vision in the family room of his house. Unable to support his delusions, Ronnie leaves him. Alone and dejected, Norman watches television and sees Devil's Tower, which is the site of a nerve gas leak in Wyoming. Ignoring the danger, he heads straight for Wyoming, knowing he belongs there. He tries to sneak into the quarantine zone and is captured by men in containment suits. The man who confiscated the camera in the earlier plane scene returns to interrogate Norman, and he introduces himself as Robert Lacombe, leader of the team investigating the UFO phenomenon. Lacombe seems genuinely interested in Norman, but a military commander insists that that Norman be flown out with the others. Norman is taken to a helicopter where other believers who ventured into the danger zone are boarded. In this version, everyone in the helicopter runs for the mountain. Many are captured, but Norman, a young woman named Gillian, and an Irish man named Colin O'Connor get away. Lacombe argues with the military that the civilians who came into the quarantine zone should stay, but the military brushes him off. Norman and Gillian make it to the other side of the mountain, escaping knockout gas, but the Irishmen failed to get away. UFOs begin to appear at a landing zone that Gillian and Norman discover. Above, UFOs move around the night sky, seemingly appearing as constellations, then changing shapes. Lacombe tells the synthesizers to attempt communication with atonal notes, and the UFOs respond. Norman makes it to the ground after the mothership lands, and Lacombe notices him. He asks Norman what he wants, and he replies that he wants to know it's real. Above, Gillian observes as Norman is included with the candidates to go off-world with the aliens. 100 aliens disembark from the mothership, and they are very happy, trying to communicate, touching objects, and investigating. Norman is then led on to the mothership while Gillian takes pictures as the theme song for When You Wish Upon a Star plays as the ship flies away. Stephen, Julia, and Michael turned in the script to Columbia, and the studio realized the film would be around $4.5 million to make. Although it was a little too much, Jaws was destroying the box office, and the studio believed Steven Spielberg would be a messiah for their studio to get them firmly solvent again. So, hoping in that, they went ahead. During banking debates and studio politics with contracts after financial approval, Steven Spielberg's second draft would be finished by September 2nd, 1975. In that script, Robert Lacombe was turned into a Frenchman in honor of the French's professional and praised investigation of UFOs per Dr. Allen Hynek. As a result, a translator character was created. Spielberg had many scenes to involve the UFO investigation team's encounter. He added a subplot about Navy Flight 19, which would be found by the investigators. There was an idea to have crop circles in the film and a ship found in the desert. Stephen added that Norman would be fired from his job for abandoning his post during the blackout. Norman is even interviewed by reporters over what he claimed to see, and he is later edited to look like a nut job when the report airs. At the summit, where folks are looking at the skies, Ronnie wants to make out with Norman, but he keeps looking at the sky. Gillian was also expanded upon. She was given a 4-year-old son named Barry. In this version, their kitchen is ransacked, and while her son is chasing playful aliens, she goes after her boy. In this movie, her son is not abducted. Instead, when Gillian becomes obsessed with the visions of the mountain, she has her son looked after by her father, while she sorts things out and heads to the mountain for reasons she does not understand. There, she meets up with Norman again, who she met on the summit while chasing her son. At the end of the film, many abductees debark the alien ship, including Navy Flight 19. The script caused the budget to rise more and more, and was toppling $5.4 million. However, Jaws was still number one and beat The Godfather as the highest grossing movie ever made. Columbia kept the faith, even though it was way out of their budget parameters. Instead of fighting the new budget, they held their breath, waiting to see what was next. Just like you now have to do until our next video arrives next Friday, where we cover more behind the scenes and yet more upcoming hurdles this movie had to face to become a Go Picture.
Go Picture! Go Picture!
I also wanted to take a short moment to point out some great material that helped us make this video. Beyond the many documentaries out there about this film, I highly suggest checking out Ray Morton's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the making of Steven Spielberg's classic film. We will also be using information from Bob Balaban's Close Encounters of the Third Kind diary, and of course the Steven Spielberg authored film novel. We used all of these for researching our Close Encounters videos, and they are great reads. If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Use super thanks. It helps.